Chapter 5 of Galatians is another one of those chapters that is very, very important. I know I feel like I say that on each one of these chapters, but chapter 5 is a very important chapter in this book of Galatians. Let me begin reading with verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty, wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, sometimes when people read this without considering the context, they might think, well, what he's saying here is don't commit any more sins, which is, of course, good advice and a good goal. But he's not talking about sin here. When he says don't be entangled again with the yoke of bondage, what he's specifically referring to is what he ended chapter 4 talking about. Don't be entangled again with the bondage to the Old Testament law. Remember, chapter 4 ended with a discussion of Abraham's two children, Ishmael and Isaac. And he said Ishmael is like the people who are born by human effort and human work, and that corresponds to people who try to approach God by the Old Testament law. So when he says stand fast in the liberty that Christ has made us free, he's saying don't be entangled again with the Old Testament law and all of its works and all of its requirements. Don't be entangled with that. It's a yoke of bondage. It's interesting that Peter calls it the same thing in Acts chapter 15. Peter says, speaking to the conference that was held then, why do we want to try to put a yoke of bondage on the Gentiles which neither we nor our fathers were able to bear? Christ brings us freedom. He doesn't bring us into bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you in verse 2, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now, the reason he mentions circumcision is because circumcision was, we might say, the initiation or the rite of entrance into the Old Testament law. It was a token, a symbolic token of obedience to the Old Testament law, and it symbolizes submission to the Old Testament law. We could say, if you choose performance, Christ shall profit you nothing. Or if you choose to approach God by your own efforts, Christ will profit you nothing. Verse 3 says, For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, or that is, who chooses to approach God by the Old Testament law, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ has become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified or made righteous by the law. You are fallen from grace. Now, because I emphasize grace and talk about grace a lot, sometimes people will say, don't you think it's possible to fall from grace? And I have to say, yes, it is. And Paul tells us how to fall from grace right here. He says, if you choose to leave Christ and go to the Old Testament law, or if you choose to try to incorporate obedience to the Old Testament law in your faith with Christ, what you have done is you have made what Christ has done for you meaningless, and you have fallen out of that relationship of grace. Now, that doesn't mean you're lost, or that doesn't mean you're going to hell. That doesn't mean your relationship with God is severed. That just means if you're going to approach God by your performance, then it's not by His grace. It's either by His grace or by your work, but not both. So Paul here is admonishing them to stand fast in the liberty which is granted to us by faith in Christ through His grace. Now let me read you these verses from the Message translation. I think it'll make it even more pointed and plain. Chapter 5 of Galatians. Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. This is very good advice. I am emphatic about this. The moment any one of you submits to circumcision or any other rule-keeping system, at the same time Christ's hard-won gift of freedom is squandered. I repeat my warning. The person who accepts the ways of circumcision trades all the advantages of a free life in Christ for obligations of a slave life to the law. I suspect that you would never intend this, but this is what happens. When you attempt to live by your own religious plans and projects, you are cut off from Christ. You fall out of grace. Now, as I've been going through this book of Galatians, it's crossed my mind that some of you might be wondering why I'm dealing with this, or why I'm even bothering to go through this. Many reasons, but one is there are a lot of spiritual bullies out there in the world. There are a lot of people who want to take advantage of you and want to control you, and I'm not quite sure why people want to be this way. I've encountered many people like that in my life, but I want you to be strong and be able to stand fast, as Paul says, in the grace of God, and know that if you've got Jesus, you've got everything you need. Don't let someone bully you or control you or try to bring you away from or entice you away from your faith in Christ. Paul says in verse 5, we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ there's neither circumcision avails anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which works by love. Then he says to the Galatians, "You did run well. Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? This persuasion comes not from him that calls you." In other words, this idea of going to the Old Testament law, this doesn't come from Jesus. This doesn't come from the one that called you. Let's see. Let me skip a little bit because I'm going to run out of time here. Verse 11, "And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, or that is performance or obedience to the law, why do I yet suffer persecution? For then the offense of the cross is ceased." Now this is a remarkable verse because Paul says the message of the cross is offensive. And the reason it's offensive is it offends people who think that they are relating to God by their human performance. It offends people who think that they've done so many good things and they're so much better than everybody else that they've got some extra brownie points with God. The message of the cross makes everyone equal. The message of the cross says that we only relate to God through faith in Christ. So really, your human performance and my human performance don't count anymore. Really, what we do in our human performance under grace is just the outflow or the outcome of our relationship with God. But it doesn't establish it and it doesn't make it any better. But the cross is an offensive message. And if you don't believe me, just try preaching it sometime. Just try to take some of these messages that you've been hearing me say, just try to go preach it for yourself and see how offensive it is to people. Verse 12, "I would that they were even cut off which trouble you. For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not your liberty for an occasion for the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Paul here says you have been called to liberty, but don't abuse your liberty, don't abuse your freedom for selfishness. In other words, when he says don't use your liberty as an occasion for the flesh, don't use the fact that Jesus has made you free for an opportunity to be selfish and serve yourself. But because Christ has made you free, use it for an opportunity to love, and by love to serve one another. And then he points out something that's very true in verse 14. All the law is fulfilled in this one word, even this, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we've talked about this when we covered the book of Romans, but let me point it out again. You know, the Ten Commandments there are two kinds of commandments. Some of them relate to your relationship with God, and some of them relate to your relationship with everybody around you. But if you love God, and if you receive His love for you, and if you love those around you, you don't need a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not murder," if you love your neighbor. If you love everybody that you come in contact with, you're not going to kill anyone. So you don't need the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not murder." And the commandment that says, don't covet the things that belong to your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to covet what belongs to him. In fact, you're more likely to give what you have to him. So what Paul is saying here is the love that God first expressed to us and that we receive and that we express then to one another, that kind of love, that God kind of love that's not selfish but giving, is a fulfillment of the law. And really, there's no need for a law if you have that kind of relationship with God and with everyone else.